Our next speakers will be Tzeporah Berman and Sophia from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Tzeporah Berman has been designing climate justice and environmental advocacy campaigns and advising governments for over 30 years, and is a co-founder of the international program director at Stand.Earth, the founder and chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and serves as a member of the advisory group for Influence Map. And Sophia Linfield is a climate activist from Halifax, Nova Scotia, the unceded and ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq. She currently works for Stand.Earth as Canada lead for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty campaign, for My Climate Plan as a community organizer, and for the Youth Climate Justice Policy Network as the policy advisor. With no further ado, they are joining us virtually. So let's hear about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. Sorry I can't be with you in person. And I had a couple of other presentations this morning in other countries, so I'm sorry. I've just joined, and I hope I'm not covering ground that you've already covered. But I'm so thrilled to be with you and to hear of the interest in the Fossil Fuel Treaty. I thought I would start from the beginning so that you have the background of why a fossil fuel treaty when we already have a Paris Agreement, and what the logic behind it is. So I'm just going to do the tech, make sure I can share my screen. All right. So where to start? I think it's always important when we're talking about where we're at and what to do, to start from sometimes I think of it as staring into the sun, the big hard stuff. This year, many of you, I'm sure, know that carbon is accumulating in our atmosphere faster than any other time in history. We're going to hear a lot this year, the 10th anniversary of Paris, around what we've done and what we're doing. And there is good news. Someone told me, was it yesterday, that I heard that 1 in 5 cars on the planet this year sold will be electric. That last year we had double the investment in renewable energy, $2 trillion, than we did in fossil fuel energy. Only $1 trillion in investment. Only $1 trillion in investment. And that's huge news, and it's great. But one of the most disturbing things I heard when I was in New York for the UN General Assembly recently was people saying, we've turned the corner now, and now that renewable energy is cheaper, which it is in every major market around the world, than fossil fuels, it will start replacing fossil fuels. And I think it's important for us to understand that this moment that we're living in, it's the last gasp of the fossil fuel industry. If the markets weren't so distorted by $7 trillion a year in subsidies, that's public money going to the most profitable companies in the history of the planet, then maybe that would be true. Renewables would be cheaper, and we would be using less fossil fuels, and fossil fuel projects wouldn't be going ahead. But what I've learned, especially over the past 5 years of building the idea of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty around the world, is that every company, every country, including our own, thinks that they can be the last barrel sold. That we need to keep our fossil fuels alive, because as long as people are still using it, it might as well be ours. That idea is what threatens everything we love. Because it's great that we have countries now through the UN process, including our own, that has agreed to tripling renewable capacity around the world. We have to do that. We have to move to electrification and decarbonization. That's true. But the atmosphere doesn't care how many solar panels we build, actually. It cares how many fossil fuel projects we don't build. And right now, we're building a lot more fossil fuel projects. So the logic of the fossil fuel treaty starts there. And it started for me actually in Alberta, in the oil sands when I was appointed as the co-chair of the Oil Sands Advisory Working Group with the former CEO of Shell and an Indigenous leader, Melody Lapine from the Mikisew Cree. And we were charged with creating consensus in Alberta over climate policy. You can imagine what those couple of years were like. I learned a lot. And one of the most important things that I learned there informed the creation of the Fossil Fuel Treaty, which is now spreading around the world, which is that every country thinks that they're responsible only for reducing the demand, for reducing emissions and pollution. And meanwhile, fossil fuel production continues to grow. And what we build today will be what we use tomorrow. So every year we miss our targets. In fact, I'm sure you've already talked about today that Canada is well off track to meet our emissions reductions targets. And of course, we're building more fossil fuel infrastructure and projects. And now in Canada, of course, the oil sands are responsible for the far majority of our growth in emissions and over a third of Canada's emissions. And that's just from the production side. I actually had a minister who will remain unnamed say to me at one point when I was designing the fossil fuel treaty, but Zap, if we're responsible for emissions and production, there might be double counting. And it wouldn't be so bad for the world if that was what happened. If in the next couple of years we have double counting, then we might actually get on track. The system that we've created is just a system that we've created for modeling, for analysis, which distorts the reality of what's happening on the ground. Because, oh, let's see if I can move this. Yep. Um, the fact is that climate policy and climate negotiations super complicated. But what's not complicated is 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere today come from three things. They come from oil, gas, and coal. Three products. Three products are getting trapped in our atmosphere. The carbon is getting trapped in our atmosphere in a way that is creating a blanket that is smothering the earth, causing the extreme weather, the rise in fires and floods and lethal heat around the world. You know, this year, the IMF reported that it is costing us now $16 million an hour. In fact, not just now, but over the last 20 years, $16 million an hour is what extreme weather is costing us. The WHO reported this year that around 175,000 people are dying from lethal heat just in the European region alone now a year. 100 million people displaced or impacted by fires around the world this year. We have a tremendous ability to normalize what's happening around the world. We can't let that happen. We have to talk about the impacts, and we have to talk about the fact that these impacts come directly from fossil fuel projects. For over 30 years, fossil fuels have been invisible in climate policy and climate negotiations. In fact, the Fossil Fuel Treaty's first campaign, which we launched at Glasgow COP, was "It's time to say the F words" at COP. And it forced a conversation about fossil fuels. So where are we today? The production gap report, which just came out in September, shows that we're on track to produce 120% more fossil fuels, more fossil fuel production than is consistent with meeting Paris goals. 120% more by 2030. And in fact, what we know is that we already have enough. We have enough oil, gas, and coal under production or on the surface of the planet that if we burn it, it will take us past 2 degrees. So every new project, in fact, takes us beyond what is safe. And we not only need to stop expanding and manage a wind down of fossil fuel assets and infrastructure, we also actually do need to draw carbon from the atmosphere, because today we're at 424 parts per million of carbon trapped in our atmosphere. We have to get back to something like 350. So we are going to need lots of new technologies if they work, and to protect as much forest as absolutely possible, to plant as much forest as absolutely possible. But it's not okay for our country and many other countries to be saying that we're going to ensure carbon capture and storage and tree planting, and therefore we can continue to expand fossil fuel production and projects. The math doesn't add up, not anymore. So a lot of people, again, will say that renewables are the answer. And what I think is important to look at is what has happened in the last decade, because we've had a dramatic increase in renewable energy around the planet. But 20, 10 years ago, 80% of the energy that we used on the planet came from fossil fuels. Today, about 80% of the energy that we use on the planet comes from fossil fuels. Renewable energy isn't just going to magically displace fossil fuels. We're going to see people just wanting both, wanting our cake and eat it too. But we can transition. And the transition is already happening in many countries in the world, but this has to be a global transition. And in order for that to happen, we need leadership and we need international cooperation between countries. And that's especially important for countries where they don't have the benefits we have, the economy that we have. There's been some tremendous work over the last couple of years looking at equity in fossil fuel production decline. And that's one of the basis of the Fossil Fuel Treaty. You don't need to, and obviously you can't see the details of this graph, but what's really important in it is to understand that there are some countries that will have a far greater difficulty in phasing out production, not just use of fossil fuels, but especially production. Malaysia, where 70% of their GDP now comes from fossil fuel production and exports, or a country like Ecuador, where they're drilling for new oil in the heart of the Amazon just to feed their debt. So we've never had any agreements globally on who gets to produce what and how much. And so, how can we keep to a global carbon budget if all that we're assessing is who gets to pollute and how much? Without international agreements to constrain the production of fossil fuels, it makes the transition harder. It makes it an unmanaged versus a managed decline. It creates stranded assets and massive financial turmoil. And of course, it increases the risks to workers and communities because we're not planning for that decline. The idea that we're saying we need to phase out fossil fuels, which 190 countries have now committed to through the COP process, but we're not planning to decrease production, is delusional thinking. 80% of the carbon capture and storage projects that have been proposed around the world in the last 10 years have underperformed. They're not working at scale, certainly not fast enough to keep us safe. So we need to remember that if we allow production to increase, it creates lock in of infrastructure, of new fossil fuel emissions in the future, but also lock-in of the political and financial power of this industry. We've been hearing now for years, of course, from our own Prime Minister Mark Carney in 2014 in his famous speech, more recently from the International Energy Agency, from the UN Secretary General, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that there is no room for new fossil fuel projects. We need to cap emissions and production. We need absolute decline of fossil fuel emissions and production. So what are we doing about that? I was pretty shocked when I started doing this research to try and understand what other countries were doing about aligning production with Paris goals, to realize that the Paris Agreement doesn't even mention fossil fuels once. I remember searching the Paris agreements for the words oil, gas, coal, fossil fuels, and realizing that it didn't even include them. Behind our backs, while countries have been setting targets and emissions reduction targets, the fossil fuel industry has been growing production, has been infiltrating negotiations and policy tables at every level to try and ensure that the onus is on us to use less of it and not on them for the production of fossil fuels, to ensure that they continue to make record profits. And let's be clear, these are record soaring profits, $2.8 billion a day, every day in pure profit for the last 50 years. This is the wealthiest industry and most powerful industry in the history of humanity. They're not going to go down without a fight and not without leadership. There are good people in the fossil fuel industry, good people that deserve a plan, good people that are stuck in bad systems, But that doesn't mean they should be at the table when we're designing policies that should be managing the decline of these companies. In fact, they shouldn't be at the table. We've learned a lot from the leadership of Pacific Island nations, some of the most vulnerable nations on Earth, who in fact proposed the world's first treaty to ban fossil fuels way back in 2016. And it was from this basis and the work of academics Andrew Sim and Peter Newell that we started thinking about what could a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty look like? What could it look like if countries cooperate? We started bringing the idea of constraining fossil fuels with, of course, many other organizations and movements around the world within the COP processes, COP 26, 27, 28, and so on. But it really wasn't for 28 COPs till we really pulled back the curtains and we started having a conversation about fossil fuels. It's constrained within the COP process, though, because this is a process that's by consensus. Saudi Arabia made sure of that 30 years ago. And so the result is that they can block any mention of fossil fuels, any actual work plans. So we see the fossil fuel treaty as a work plan for fossil fuel phase out that is a companion to the Paris Agreement. It doesn't replace it. The Paris Agreement is critical. There's so much important work that is happening inside the Paris Agreement and related work plans, but there is yet no work plan for phasing out fossil fuels, for cooperation between countries. And that's what the Fossil Fuel Treaty is. There are three pillars being developed for the treaty. A just transition. How do we help countries move their economies away from fossil fuels? What kind of international agreements can exist in order to do that? How do we develop a plan that allows governments to stop building out the problem? And how do we ensure that this phase out of existing fossil fuel production is fair to all countries? We've studied 5 other treaties as models, looking at what we can learn from the Montreal Protocol, nuclear weapons, the Mine Ban Treaty. In some ways, in fact, the Mine Ban Treaty has been a real inspiration for us because what we saw there is that when there was a really intransigent issue with vested interests that couldn't move inside the United Nations, it was actually Canada that stepped up and hosted the Ottawa Convention. The Ottawa Convention, initially, the idea was 20 or so countries with high ambition around mines coming together to see if they could set new rules. That process led to very strong rules, which was eventually brought inside the United Nations. And that is the political pathway we're looking at for the fossil fuel treaty. So there are 5 phases towards building a treaty. The first, in the first couple of years that many of you were a part of, was around building the movement. Of course, that continues all the way along. But our countries are not going to step out and talk about decreasing fossil fuel production unless they have support, unless they have political space, social license to do that. That's why we're calling on cities to pass motions towards a fossil fuel treaty to encourage their nation states to start participating in the development of the treaty. And Sophie will tell you a little bit more about that soon. We have to build the political buy-in. That's why we've been talking to scientists and Nobel laureates and faith leaders around the world to build that buy-in. And then we have to create a multilateral process. And that's the stage we're in now. I'm excited to tell you that just today, actually, the senior officials from the 17 countries that are participating in the development right now of the fossil fuel treaty are meeting in Brasilia with many observers to look at some of the ideas for the political pathway, as well as some of the research that our expert finance group from the Global South has created on trade and tax and debt agreements that could exist under a fossil fuel treaty. So we've now started to convene countries, both at a ministerial level and a senior official level. And in New York, Colombia announced that they are going to host the first ever diplomatic conference on fossil fuel phase out in April of next year. So, kind of like the Ottawa Convention, this will be the Santa Maria Convention, I guess, in Colombia. which will be a historic moment. The first time countries have gathered to actually make a plan for a fossil fuel phase out. And we expect many more countries, other even more than are participating right now in the development of the fossil fuel treaty. We've already had word from 20 to 30 countries, and we're hopeful for 50 countries to participate in April in that conference. And it will be a historic moment. So these series of convenings can either lead to a UNGA resolution or an independent conference. Right now, we're going on the left side of this model to an independent conference where countries start to agree to negotiate a treaty, develop a treaty. And this is important for you if you're working on fossil fuel treaty. There's no text yet. There are principles, there are research, and there's research and development under the mechanisms that could exist, but the countries have to negotiate a text. And so that's what they are starting to do. The table is being laid for those negotiations, which could begin as early as next year. And then the countries can either adopt it independently, it can be adopted by the UN General Assembly or by a UN committee. So where are we in developing the political space and social license? The first countries to join us were from the South Pacific. Vanuatu and Tuvalu announced on the floor of the UN General Assembly that they would endorse the idea of a fossil fuel treaty and encouraged countries to join. They held the first ever diplomatic meeting on a fossil fuel treaty and created the Port Vila call for a fossil-free Pacific several years ago. We now have 17 countries, including Colombia, the fifth largest coal exporter in the world, Pakistan, Bahamas, Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Nauru have all joined us in the last couple of years. And there are at least 5 other countries who we believe will join within the next year. So these are the countries who will be formally sitting at the table to participate in the development of the fossil fuel treaty. And the campaign is growing. We have over 3,800 organizations around the world in 118 countries that have now endorsed the idea of a fossil fuel treaty or are working on a fossil fuel treaty. Everyone from the World Health Organization and WWF and other big organizations to small grassroots organizations around the world. Cardinals from the Vatican and over 420 other faith institutions, in fact, every major religion in the world. 101 Nobel laureates have called for the fossil fuel treaty. Increasingly, we're seeing unions from around the world joining the fossil fuel treaty. The European Parliament has passed a motion formally endorsing. We now have 17 banks that have endorsed and have committed to no new fossil fuel investment and are endorsing the call for the fossil fuel non-proliferation. Increasingly, we're seeing subnational states join: Hawaii, California, ACT in Australia, and people around the world, indigenous nations from the Rwanda in the heart of the Amazon to folks all across now Africa, in Kenya and Ethiopia and Malawi. We have a champions program where we're seeing eminent leaders like Ban Ki-moon and scientists and authors and artists from around the world join the call for the treaty. So all told, we have about 135 cities and subnationals, over 1 million individuals, 800 individual parliamentarians, including many from Canada. Of course, Senator Rosa Galvez, a great hero of mine. Now, sorry, 25 banks, not 17, and many faith institutions. The way that we're set up is a global secretariat. We support the campaigns and communications. We also do the research that is forming the basis for the countries who are negotiating the treaty. It's all available online. Our briefing notes to governments, as well as our research papers, are all free online at the fossilfueltreaty.org. So you can start to understand both the impacts of fossil fuels as well as how countries could cooperate to create a fossil fuel treaty. I wanted to spend one quick moment before I finish on the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice this year declared its first ruling on climate change in July 2025. This, of course, was a result, again, from the leadership of the South Pacific countries of Vanuatu and Tuvalu, especially, who began to call for a fossil fuel treaty, campaigned for 5 years to achieve the ICJ outcome. While it's not legally binding, we are already seeing the impact. Over 30 new lawsuits have been filed, climate litigation against the major oil and gas companies. We're seeing the ICJ advisory opinions show up in litigation around the world, in policy development around the world. Critical, the ICJ opinion outlines the need for cooperation between states, the need for common but differentiated responsibilities. It also explicitly calls for an end to the expansion of the production of fossil fuels and a managed wind down. The Fossil Fuel Treaty is now being talked about around the world. Last year, we had over 3,000 media articles in hundreds of countries around the world talking about this idea. The campaign expanded across Europe to artists around the world. This isn't a great picture, but I had to include it because this is a group of musicians called This Is Our Home who formed a band to campaign for the Fossil Fuel Treaty. They're from the South Pacific, mostly Samoa and Fiji, but many other islands. They're amazing and you should look them up. But they Coldplay heard about them and listened to them and invited them to play on stage with them, both in France and New Zealand. So this is our home, their story of what's happening to their homes in the South Pacific and why they're calling for a fossil fuel treaty is now being heard by millions of people around the world. They said something to me, which I think is important as we think about campaigning on climate change. They said you're going to open people's minds to what's necessary, but we'll open their hearts. We can't forget that whether you're a minister or whether you're working in the industry, you're a real person with a heart and a mind. And all of that is going to be necessary for us to reach all of those aspects of people in order to make these changes. Because I think one of the worst things that the fossil fuel industry has done is not just to fearmonger about scarcity and price increase, but they've stolen our imagination to imagine a different world, to imagine a world where we are powerful together, where we can stand up to such a powerful lobby, where we can envision a cleaner and safer world, and that where we can build it. So I want to thank you so much for being interested and for all of your work in Canada and for supporting the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And now I guess I just want to hand it over to Sophia to tell you a little bit about the campaign specifically in Canada. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Tzeporah. And I know, yeah, I'll keep it nice and brief because I know your day's running a little bit behind schedule generally, and I know we're the one thing standing probably between you and the end of it, and we're all nice and tired. So yeah, thanks so much for chatting a little bit again about the broader campaign that treaty involves. And yeah, like mentioned, cities are a really big part of how we're moving forward. A lot of that really important bottom-up organizing that, like Tzeporah mentioned, is especially crucial in countries like Canada, where we are petrol states, where we are fossil fuel producing nations, and where we do unfortunately see increasingly federal and provincial governments stepping back from climate actions and moving towards pro-fossil fuel expansion. And so, yeah, well, unfortunately, likely we're not going to be seeing in the next day or anything like that. Amazing dramatic action from our federal government on fossil fuel production. That's where we can be starting a lot of the changes at that city level. And showing, there is support for that larger international campaign, obviously, but also thinking specifically, this is a very real thing here in Canada. These aren't just theoretical words. These aren't just, plans of how we'd like to support other countries. This has very real stakes for a lot of communities here. And yeah, speaks to a very real conversation that I'm seeing happening in a lot of spots. So yeah, we've seen dozens of municipalities so far in Canada, very excitingly, sign on and endorse the treaty, which again includes rural spots, but also includes, big cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. And specifically where I've been focusing a lot of my work in supporting community groups and municipalities and municipal staff in starting conversations about treaty and endorsements of treaty has been in the Atlantic region of Canada right now, which is super exciting because we haven't seen any endorsements yet because there haven't really been a ton of campaigns east of Montreal at this point. But like mentioned in my introduction, I'm based in Halifax. I'm a Maritimer girl. We have a lot of really amazing climate action that I've seen firsthand happening here in the Maritimes and a lot of really important conversations about just transition and about fossil fuel production that need to be happening in this area with, again, a lot of local production of fossil fuels, but also deep connections, obviously, to folks going out west and working there and then coming back to the Atlantic provinces, having worked in the oil sands or in the fossil fuel industry there as well. So it has a lot of emotional stakes in this region, and we're seeing a lot of really amazing conversations starting to happen in the communities that I'm really fortunate to be supporting right now. So right now we're working on, I think it's 6 to 7 campaigns at the moment. And that ranges from Newfoundland and St. John's to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, to a couple spots in New Brunswick, Tzeporah region, and Fredericton. And yeah, just wanted to share a little bit with you folks as you go into, again, all your very exciting MP meetings that are coming up, that there are a lot of local examples of action that you can be pointing to when speaking to your MPs, because again, ultimately at the end of the day, your MPs are supposed to be there to support their communities. They're members of your communities. They're interested, or at least should be interested in what you have to say. And while we see, again, increasingly other levels of government moving away from types of climate action, I've heard from a lot of folks that I've been working with on these campaigns that it's been really impactful, not just, again, working towards that larger hopeful world that we want to see happen, but very tangibly in providing a way for folks to have a rallying point to then go to other levels of government and say, you know, maybe these are decisions that you're making or you're taking directions towards fossil fuels. But a fossil fuel treaty endorsement means that our community in particular doesn't actually agree with the direction that you're taking our larger country in. And we want you to know that every single endorsement means that that population isn't on board with what you're looking at on a more national level. And that's particularly important, thinking about our place within larger international work on treaty as well, to be able to talk about, you know, XYZ% of the population lives in a place that has passed a fossil fuel treaty within the country. So even if Canada as a nation state, you know, maybe isn't going to put out, again, a statement tomorrow supporting it, there are literal millions of people who are in favor and who are having these conversations in their communities. And they're able to use those to advocate to their federal government. They're able to use those to advocate for support for funding for municipal and local climate actions. We're seeing this being used a couple of campaigns, specifically in Tzeporah. There's a new gas plant that's being proposed there by an American company that's come in, and there's huge amounts of local community backlash against it. And treaty is going to be part of that campaign to talk about, you know, this isn't just words on a page. It isn't just a theoretical thing. This is directly talking about the communities we want to build, the jobs that we want to have, the world that we want to inherit on that local level. And so we're seeing really cool further actions come out of treaty being used as that first step to open the door to some of those conversations. So thank you so much for the time to chat a little bit about some of the super exciting work that's happening. If you're based in the Atlantic area in any of those spots, I'd love to chat with you more if you're interested in getting involved in any of the campaigns. And I'm also here to be a support for any other communities across all of Canada, if you're interested in starting some more local campaigns as well to talk about what a treaty endorsement could look like at your city. So yeah, I'll be putting my email in the chat here, and I'm sure the event organizers can share it as well, because I'm here to support any potential work you'd like to do on that. And otherwise, wish you all the best of luck with all your meetings coming up this week. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much to both of our speakers for sharing all of that information about this really impressive and inspiring work. Also, there are some wonderful questions. Unfortunately, we are a little bit short on time at the moment, so I think we'll just have to go with one question. Lucky one, I'm not sure who asked this one, but if I could ask both of our presenters, what do we say when confronted with the claim that if we don't produce it, someone else will?
I'd be happy to start, Sophia, and please. Well, first of all, that's no longer true from a technical perspective, because there are transportation issues, there are refining issues. It's not true that if it just doesn't get produced somewhere, it will get produced somewhere else. But setting aside those technical issues, I think the larger issue is that leadership matters. right now in history and has throughout history. So when a country, no, let me give you the words of a country. When President Petro from Colombia joined the Fossil Fuel Treaty, he said from the dais, he said, I know that every day we're making the problem worse, and we can't stop alone unless there is international cooperation. And I believe that our committing today to end expansion as a country who relies on the production of fossil fuels will help inspire other countries to join us. If we are going to protect life on Earth, he said, this is the choice we have to make. And that kind of leadership has inspired other countries. Other countries are now coming to us saying, you know, I've been really inspired by speaking to Minister Mohammed and President Petro, and we'd like to look at how we can do this. The fossil fuel treaty doesn't say turn off the taps overnight. It says that we have to manage a wind down. We have to together stop expansion. And that's really important. It is not okay. It's not okay right now. Every ton of carbon matters. Every ton of carbon that we save from going into the atmosphere will save lives. So when a decision maker says, well, we might as well produce it, they're saying that they're okay with that. We are currently on track for somewhere between 2.7 and 3.4 degrees in our lifetimes. What does that mean? That means millions of people will die. So every project that we produce right now will impact that. And demand is soft. In fact, just last week, and I'll end here, it's one of my favorite topics, as you can tell, but just last week, several oil companies were quoted as saying, now supply is creating demand. So while electric cars are taking off and renewable energy is cheaper, they're hard at work trying to oversupply in order to create demand for fossil fuels. And so that has flipped. The industry itself is saying that.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just jump on, to pick out those two pieces, which I think is very much there's an economic response and there's a moral response that you can have to that. And I was hearing other folks chat about in earlier sessions, depending on who you're going to talk to. Well, again, all of us in this room, I imagine, probably are quite on board with the moral imperative that we have to be acting on this. Unfortunately, that is not shared often, a lot of times, by the decision makers that we are speaking to. And so, again, it's all well and good. And I think it's very vital, that we're not tiptoeing around the fact that, like Tzeporah said, we do have a moral imperative to act. Every single, bit of carbon that we're doing is locking us into more and more climate impacts. We know that, again, sea level rise is going to be a huge impact here. We know that the Arctic is warming, multiple times faster than the rest of the world, and we're a country that has Arctic land within it. So again, even from a selfish level, again, Canada has a very large moral and safety imperative to be acting on this. But also in terms of, again, that economic argument, we see other countries are looking to be those leaders on renewables, on that just transition. And the whole point of Fossil Fuel Treaty is we will be forced to change at some point, whether we like it or not. And we can either do that last minute, grasping around in the midst of many other crises that will likely be happening at that point due to our climate change world, or we can be making a plan now. And like the reason Colombia is coming on board, the reason they are doing that is, sure, they could keep on producing that. They could be the last, barrel of oil in the world, whatever that argument is. But they recognize that it also makes economic sense to be a first mover on this, to be transitioning their jobs, transitioning their economies over to more long-term sustainable and economically viable pathways. And it only makes sense to me at the very least, and I'm sure, again, I'm preaching to the choir in this room, that we would be shifting that production over, because sure, someone else could produce it, but Canada does have a responsibility to, take care of itself and be taking care of the rest of the world by recognizing its role as a producer that is impacting not only its own country, but the rest of the world as well with that. But it is a
I'm
question that's
sorry
going to come up.
I'm sorry we weren't able to get to more questions. I understand you've got a tight agenda, but I hope if you have more questions, you'll send them to us. Tzeporah at fossilfueltreaty.org or Sophia at stand.earth. Please send us your questions. We'd be happy to support you in figuring out how to talk about these issues.
100%.